The night the Larder House won the city's most prestigious restaurant award, the dish that earned Dean Whitford a standing ovation was mine. 2 years of development, hundreds of tests, and 14 months on my menu before he ever served it. My brother Connor was the one who sold it to him. And that night, Connor was standing right behind Dean on that stage, smiling for the cameras. Neither of them knew that before the evening was over, everything they had built on my work was going to come apart in front of the same room that had just applauded them. My name is Lauren Marsh, and this is the story of how my brother handed everything I built to the wrong person, how the truth found its way into print, and how the award that was stolen from me eventually ended up exactly where it belonged. If this story hits close to home, subscribe and drop a like right now. It helps more people find stories like this one. Connor is 5 years older than me. We grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that always smelled like something cooking. Our grandmother lived 2 streets over and treated every family visit like an occasion worth feeding people properly. I was in her kitchen before I was tall enough to reach the counter without a step stool, and by the time I was 12 I had developed opinions about seasoning that she took seriously enough to argue with. Food was never just food to me. It was the most precise and honest form of attention I knew how to give anything. Connor was different. He was organized, persuasive, and comfortable in rooms full of people in a way I never quite managed. He handled money well and understood systems and could negotiate with vendors and contractors without ever seeming rattled. When I told him I wanted to open a restaurant, he was the first person to say it was possible and the first to offer to help make it happen. We were different enough that a partnership made sense. I would run the kitchen. He would run everything else, and together we would build something neither of us could have built alone. Ember Salt opened on a Thursday evening in late October in a narrow brick building in the French Quarter district that had been a print shop for 40 years before we signed the lease. The dining room seated 42 people. The kitchen was smaller than I would have liked, but designed to exactly the workflow I needed. The menu was built entirely around my own recipes, dishes I had been developing and refining for years, rooted in Southern technique but pushed in directions that felt genuinely new to me. The opening night reservation list filled up in under 6 hours. For the first 2 years, everything we had planned seemed to be working. The reviews were strong, the regulars came back consistently, and the reputation we were building felt like something real rather than something borrowed. Connor handled the financials, the supplier relationships, and the front-of-house staffing while I focused entirely on the food. We argued occasionally about money and priorities the way business partners do, but nothing that couldn't be resolved over a long conversation and a late dinner after service ended. What I didn't see was that Connor had been paying attention to something I hadn't, the gap between what Ember Salt was earning and what it could be earning if the food existed somewhere with more capital behind it. He had been watching that gap for months before he ever walked into the Larder House for the first time. And by the time I noticed anything was wrong, he had already decided what he was going to do about it. Ember Salt had taken 2 years to build into something people talked about. Not the kind of talking that comes from a good review or a lucky mention in a local magazine, the kind that comes from regulars who bring their friends without being asked, from tables that book 3 weeks out because people have learned that waiting is worth it. That reputation was built entirely in the kitchen, dish by dish, service by service, through the kind of repetitive invisible work that nobody outside a restaurant ever fully understands. Connor had been essential to the operational side of all of it. He negotiated supplier contracts, managed the front-of-house staff, handled the bookkeeping, and dealt with every landlord and licensing issue that came up without pulling me out of the kitchen to solve it. The division worked because we trusted each other completely and because neither of us wanted to do the other's job. I had never once questioned his access to the recipe documentation, the supplier relationships, or the financial accounts. He was my brother and my partner, and those 2 things had always felt like the same thing. The first sign I missed came 8 months before Connor resigned. A supplier I had worked with since opening called to confirm a change in our standing order that I hadn't requested. I told him it was a mistake and asked him to revert it. He apologized and said Connor had called earlier that week to adjust the allocation. I mentioned it to Connor that evening, and he said he had been trying to reduce costs and had forgotten to loop me in. The explanation was reasonable and I let it go. The second sign came 3 months later. Connor started arriving at the restaurant later than usual and leaving earlier. When I asked about it, he said he was dealing with some personal matters and that everything was under control. I didn't push. We had always given each other room, and I saw no reason to change that. The third sign was the one I should have caught. Connor asked me one evening to walk him through the preparation of our most popular dish from start to finish, the slow-braised short rib that had been on the menu since opening and had become the dish people specifically came in to order. He said he wanted to be able to describe it accurately to a potential private events client who had asked detailed questions. I walked him through every step while he took notes on his phone. He thanked me and changed the subject. I thought nothing of it. What I understand now is that by the time Connor asked me that question, the deal with Dean Whitford was already in motion. The notes he took that evening weren't for a private events client. They were the last piece of technical documentation he needed to complete the package he was putting together. The supplier redirections had already begun. The meetings with Dean had already happened. Connor had been building toward his exit for the better part of a year while standing next to me every day in a restaurant we had built together, and I had not seen a single moment of it clearly enough to ask the right question. He resigned on a Tuesday, sat across from me at the corner table, told me he was moving to the larder house, shook my hand, and walked out. No argument, no guilt, no explanation beyond the career opportunity framing he had clearly prepared in advance. I watched him push through the front door and disappear down the street and felt something I couldn't immediately name. Not quite anger yet, not quite grief, something colder and more specific than either. The feeling of understanding something too late. The Larder House launched its new menu 5 weeks later. I saw the food writer's post on a Thursday morning before service. She described 3 dishes by name. Every one of them was mine. I read her words standing in the kitchen I had designed myself, surrounded by the equipment I had chosen and the staff I had trained, and felt the full weight of what Connor had done settle into place with a clarity that was almost physical. I closed the kitchen door, sat down on an overturned crate in the corner, and gave myself 10 minutes to feel everything I needed to feel before service started. Then I stood up, washed my hands, and started cooking. There was nothing else to do yet. But I already knew that was going to change. I drove to the Larder House that same evening after the last table cleared. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I parked across the street and walked in alone, took a seat at the bar and ordered 3 dishes from the new menu without looking at the server when I said the names because I already knew what they were called. They were called what I had called them for the past 18 months. The food arrived and I ate slowly and carefully the way I had been trained to eat, analytically, without sentiment, paying attention to every layer of every bite. It was my food. Not an interpretation of my food, not a dish inspired by my approach. It was my food, executed with my techniques, using the same sourcing specifications I had spent years refining. Whoever had cooked it in that kitchen had been given instructions precise enough that the result was nearly indistinguishable from what came out of Ember and Salt on any given night. The only thing missing was the context that made it mean something. I paid the bill, walked back to my car, and called Connor. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him I had just eaten at the Larder House. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough to confirm everything I needed confirmed. Then he said he could explain. I told him I wasn't calling for an explanation. I was calling to tell him that I knew exactly what he had done and that he was going to hear from my attorney. He said I was overreacting, that the culinary world borrowed from itself constantly, that nothing on that menu was legally protected. His voice had the careful steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, but hadn't expected to have it quite so soon. I told him the documentation disagreed with him and ended the call. The confrontation I hadn't planned happened 2 days later. Connor showed up at Ember and Salt on a Saturday afternoon, an hour before dinner service, and asked to talk. I brought him into the back office and closed the door. He sat down across from me and said he wanted to explain his side before things went further. I told him to go ahead. What he said was worse than I had expected. He said that Ember Salt had reached its ceiling, that the location and the scale would never generate the kind of revenue that made the years of work worthwhile, and that he had found a path to something bigger and had taken it. He said the recipes were as much his as mine because he had been present for every stage of their development, had provided feedback, had sourced the ingredients, and had built the operational structure that allowed them to reach customers in the first place. He said that contribution deserved recognition and compensation that Ember Salt was never going to provide. Then he looked at me and said that if I was honest with myself, I had always needed him more than he had needed me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move from my chair. I waited until he finished and then told him that what he had just described was not a partnership, it was a justification, and the difference between the two was going to become very clear very soon. Then I asked him to leave before my staff arrived for service. He left. I stood in the office alone for a few minutes, and then I walked into the kitchen and started the prep work for a dinner service that turned out to be one of the best we had run in months. Not because I wasn't angry, I was furious in a way that had no clean outlet, but because the kitchen was the one place where everything I felt translated directly into something I could control. My attorney Patricia filed the initial legal notice that Monday. By Wednesday, Dean Whitford's team had responded with a letter that reframed the entire situation as a case of parallel culinary development rooted in shared regional traditions. By Thursday, Connor had given his first interview. He did it without warning, without any legal counsel advising him to stay quiet, and without apparently considering what the documented timeline was going to do to every word he said. He spoke to a local food and lifestyle blog whose editor he had known for years, and he described the dishes at the Larder House as the product of years of collaborative development between himself and the Ember Salt culinary team. A team he characterized as having outgrown the restaurant's limited vision. He implied that the legal action I had initiated was a personal response to his departure rather than a legitimate intellectual property claim. He said the recipes belonged to the culture of Southern cooking more broadly, and that no single chef could claim ownership of a tradition. The interview went live on a Friday morning. By that afternoon, it had been picked up by 2 larger publications and shared widely enough that I was fielding calls from journalists I had never spoken to. My regulars started texting. A chef I respected in Savannah sent me a message that said simply, "Don't respond yet. Let him keep talking." That was good advice. Because Connor wasn't finished talking, and every word he said publicly was landing in a documented record that my attorney was reading with the focused attention of someone watching a gift arrive in installments. By the weekend, the story had grown larger than either of us had controlled or anticipated. And I was beginning to understand that the version of this fight I had been prepared for, quiet, legal, resolved in conference rooms, was not the fight I was actually in. The following week hit Ember Salt hard. Connor's interview had seeded a narrative that positioned the dispute as a messy sibling falling out over shared work, the kind of story that makes people uncomfortable enough to stay neutral. Neutral, in a restaurant business built on loyalty and word of mouth, looks a lot like empty tables. Reservations dropped 20% in 2 weeks. A corporate account that had been booking private dining events monthly redirected their business without explanation. 2 of my best front-of-house staff asked me privately whether the restaurant was going to survive the year. I told both of them yes. I believed it when I said it, but the margin between belief and certainty was narrower than I let on. Dean Whitford's legal team escalated the same week. They filed a counter-motion arguing that Ember Salt's recipes drew from established Southern culinary traditions and that the techniques in question were widely documented in regional cookbooks predating my restaurant by decades. They attached 17 exhibits, cookbook pages, culinary school curricula, historical menu records from Charleston restaurants going back 30 years. It was designed to bury my documentation under the weight of general culinary history. Patricia called after reading it and said it was the move she had expected and that we had the answer for it. She didn't sound worried. I was worried enough for both of us. Connor gave a second interview that week, this time to a national food industry podcast. He was more polished than the first time, measured, careful, framing everything as his genuine perspective rather than an attack. He talked about the years he had invested in Ember Salt, the supplier relationships he had built, the operational systems that had allowed the kitchen to function. He said the recipes had emerged from a collaborative environment he had been essential in creating. He said he wished me well. It was convincing enough that 3 people I considered close friends in the Charleston food community sent me messages saying they weren't sure what to believe anymore. One of them asked gently whether the situation might be more complicated than the legal framing suggested. That question, from someone who knew me and knew my work, was the lowest point of the entire period. Connor had spent 2 years standing next to me while I developed every dish on that menu, and he had turned that proximity into a credential. Presence had become authorship in the story he was telling, and I was beginning to understand that dismantling it was going to require more than documents. What changed everything arrived from a direction I hadn't anticipated. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been my sous chef for 14 months before Connor let him go 3 weeks before his own resignation, a decision Connor made unilaterally, citing budget pressures, without consulting me. I had been upset about it at the time. I now understood that Marcus had known too much about the kitchen for Connor to bring him to the larder house without raising questions neither of them wanted asked. Connor had removed him to protect the plan. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening and said he had something I needed to see. We met the following morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from Ember Salt. He put his phone on the table and showed me a series of text messages between himself and Connor from the months before the resignation. Connor had asked Marcus specific questions about recipe preparation, ingredient ratios, and sourcing specifications under the framing of documenting kitchen processes for internal training. Marcus had answered in detail, photographing recipe cards and sending the images directly to Connor's personal number. Every message was dated. All of them predated Connor's resignation and the larder house menu launch by months. They showed Connor systematically extracting technical documentation from my kitchen through deliberate deception, using a staff member who had trusted him exactly the way I had. Marcus said he had put it together when he saw the new larder house menu and recognized dishes he had photographed in his own kitchen. He was willing to provide a full statement and hand over the complete message thread. I called Patricia from the parking lot before I reached my car. She told me to bring Marcus in that afternoon. By the end of that day, the message thread had been added to our case file and Marcus had provided a signed statement. Patricia said it was the single most significant piece of evidence we had. Dean's argument about shared culinary traditions couldn't survive documentation showing Connor had extracted specific proprietary information through deliberate deception. This was no longer a dispute about who deserved credit for Southern cooking. It was a documented trail of premeditated theft. Connor had made one critical mistake. He had conducted his entire plan through text messages, which meant every decision and every lie existed in a record he couldn't reach or alter. The same organizational precision that had made him a good operations manager had made him a thorough and traceable thief. And the person he had discarded to protect his plan had saved every message. Patricia filed an amended claim the following Monday, incorporating Marcus's evidence. The new filing arranged Connor's text messages, the dated recipe card photographs, the supplier redirections, and the larder house menu launch into a single documented timeline that removed every remaining ambiguity about what had happened. Dean's 17 exhibits about Southern culinary tradition were now sitting beside evidence of a man photographing proprietary recipe cards and texting them to a competitor. The contrast was not subtle. Dean's legal team went quiet for 4 days. When they responded, the tone had shifted considerably from their confident countermotion. They requested an urgent settlement meeting. Patricia told me it was the first genuinely encouraging sign from their side and that I should let her handle it while I focused on keeping the restaurant running. Connor, however, had not gone quiet. The day after the settlement meeting request, he posted a lengthy statement on social media calling the amended filing a retaliatory escalation driven by personal bitterness. He described Marcus as a disgruntled former employee whose account was shaped by the circumstances of his termination and characterized the text messages as routine kitchen management communications taken out of context. Marcus saw the post within an hour. He called me that evening and said 2 things. First, that Connor's description of him as disgruntled was the most motivating thing anyone had said to him in months. Second, that he had found 3 additional messages he hadn't included in the original statement, messages where Connor had explicitly asked him not to mention the documentation requests to anyone in the kitchen, framing it as a surprise for a future staff training program. In the context of Connor's public statement, they looked like something else entirely. Patricia added them to the file before the settlement meeting. What forced Dean's hand wasn't just the evidence, it was the public trajectory of the story. James Whittaker had published 2 follow-up pieces tracking the legal developments. 2 chefs whose endorsement the Larder House had used in promotional materials quietly requested their names be removed from the restaurant's website. A hospitality group in early expansion discussions with Dean paused those conversations pending resolution of the dispute. The legal case was damaging, but the reputational damage was moving faster. The settlement meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia called me afterward and said Dean's team had arrived prepared to negotiate from moderate strength and had left having agreed to terms favorable in every material respect. Connor gave no more public statements after the social media post. His attorney, who he had finally hired after the amended filing, had apparently made him understand that every word he said publicly was worsening his legal position. The silence came too late to undo what the previous statements had done, but it stopped the damage from compounding further. The settlement was signed on a Friday morning. Dean agreed to permanently remove all disputed dishes, paid damages covering 18 months of measurable revenue impact, and issue a formal acknowledgement that the recipes had originated at Ember Salt. Connor settled the breach of fiduciary duty claims separately with a payment covering legal costs and a written acknowledgement that he had shared proprietary documentation with a competing establishment while still employed as managing partner. The Charleston Restaurant Association withdrew the Larder House award the same afternoon. I was in my kitchen when Patricia called to confirm everything had been signed. The lunch service had just ended and the kitchen was in that particular quiet between services, clean surfaces, organized mise en place, the low hum of equipment. I thanked her, put my phone in my pocket, and stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long moment. Then one of my line cooks came back in from break and asked if we were prepping for dinner. I told him we were. We got to work. The week after the settlement, the story finished telling itself publicly in ways neither Connor nor Dean could control anymore. James Whittaker published his 3rd and final piece on the dispute, a comprehensive account that traced the full timeline from Connor's first meeting with Dean through the settlement, incorporating the text message evidence, Marcus's statement, and the formal acknowledgement that the recipes had originated at Ember Salt. It was the kind of piece that doesn't invite debate because it doesn't need to. Every claim was sourced, every date was documented, and the sequence of events spoke with a clarity that left nothing meaningful to argue about. The culinary community responded the way small industries respond when something that everyone suspected is finally confirmed in print. Former colleagues who had stayed carefully neutral during the legal process reached out within days. 2 chefs I respected sent messages that were short and direct. They said they had watched what happened and were glad it had ended the way it did. A culinary school in Colombia that had quietly removed Ember Salt from their recommended restaurant list during the dispute put us back on without being asked. The reservation book, which had been running thin for months, started filling again in the way it had before any of this had started. Dean Whitford removed the disputed dishes from the Larder House menu the same week the settlement was signed. What remained was a menu stripped of everything that had made the restaurant's new direction interesting to anyone who had eaten there. 3 weeks after the settlement, a local food writer noted in passing that the Larder House felt directionless in a way it hadn't before the relaunch. Dean didn't respond publicly. The Larder House continued operating, but the momentum it had briefly built was gone, and without the food that had generated it, there was nothing obvious to replace it with. Connor disappeared from the Charleston food scene almost immediately. The written acknowledgement he had signed made explaining his professional history difficult in any context that required honesty, and the culinary industry in the Southeast was connected enough that the details of what he had done traveled without needing to be announced. A chef in Savannah mentioned seeing his name attached to a consulting project that fell through. A former vendor said Connor had reached out about a new venture that never materialized. The public statements he had made during the dispute, the interviews, the social media post, remained searchable and attached to his name in ways that followed him into every new conversation he tried to start. My parents drove up from Savannah 3 weeks after the settlement closed. We had dinner at Ember Salt on a slow Tuesday evening after the last table had cleared, just the three of us at the corner table with food I cooked myself after the kitchen staff had gone home. My mother said she was sorry twice during the evening, once for the early weeks when she had suggested the dispute might be more complicated than I was presenting it, and once more quietly near the end of the night for something older and harder to name that we both understood without her having to be specific about it. My father talked less than he usually did but stayed later than he usually did, which for him meant the same thing. Nobody mentioned Connor by name the entire evening. He was present in the conversation the way absent people always are when the people sitting together have all been changed by something he set in motion. I didn't feel the need to talk about him. What he had done had run its course and produced its consequences, and those consequences were his to live with in ways that had nothing more to do with me. What I felt that evening, sitting at the corner table in the restaurant I had built and fought for and kept, was something quieter and more durable than relief. The past year had cost me more than I had expected, in money, in reservations, in the specific exhaustion of having to defend something that should never have needed defending. But it had also shown me something about the restaurant and about myself that I wouldn't have known otherwise. Ember Salt had survived because the food was real and the people who worked in it were loyal, and the regulars who had stuck around during the worst months had done so because they trusted something that turned out to be worth trusting. That wasn't nothing. That was everything the restaurant had ever been built to be. After my parents left, I locked the front door, turned off the dining room lights, and walked back through the kitchen one more time before going home. The surfaces were clean, the equipment was humming quietly, and every station was set up exactly the way my team had learned to set it up over 2 years of service. I stood in the middle of it for a moment the way I had stood there the afternoon the settlement was signed, and felt the same thing I had felt then, that this was mine, had always been mine, and that nothing that had happened had changed that in any way that mattered. The Charleston Restaurant Association announced the annual awards nominations 6 weeks after the settlement closed. Ember Salt was nominated in 3 categories: Best Chef, Best New Menu, and Restaurant of the Year. I found out through an email from the association that arrived on a Monday morning while I was doing prep work before the lunch service. I read it once, set my phone down, and kept working. The nominations felt significant, but also distant in a way I couldn't fully explain, like something happening to a version of myself that existed slightly outside the kitchen where I spent most of my actual life. The awards ceremony was held on a Saturday evening in late October at a hotel ballroom in downtown Charleston. The same venue, the same format, the same room where the Larder House had accepted an award built on my recipes 8 months earlier. I had thought about that parallel more than once in the weeks leading up to the evening and had decided it was either deeply ironic or simply the way things worked in a city where the same spaces held different stories in different years. I chose to read it as the latter. I arrived with my sous chef Daniel and 2 of my senior line cooks who had stayed through the hardest months without being asked to. We sat at a round table near the front and ordered drinks and talked about the menu changes we were planning for the winter season, which was a more comfortable conversation than anything related to the evening's proceedings. The room filled around us with the specific energy of an industry gathering, loud, warm, familiar in the way that rooms full of people who share a profession always feel familiar even when you don't know everyone in them. The Restaurant of the Year category was announced last. The presenter read the nominees, and I listened to my own name with the slight unreality that had accompanied every public moment of the past several months. When she opened the envelope and said Ember Salt, the table erupted before I had fully processed the words. Daniel grabbed my arm. One of my line cooks stood up immediately and started clapping before anyone around us had reacted. The room followed a few seconds later with the kind of applause that builds rather than arrives all at once. I walked to the stage and accepted the award from the presenter, who shook my hand with both of hers and said something I couldn't fully hear over the noise of the room. I stood at the microphone and looked out at the ballroom, the same lights, the same configuration of tables and faces, and took a breath before speaking. I thanked my team first and specifically by name, starting with Daniel and moving through every person who had shown up for service during the months when showing up had required something beyond ordinary professional commitment. I thanked Marcus Webb, who was sitting at a table near the back and raised his glass when I said his name. I thanked Patricia Owens without explaining why, because everyone in the room who had followed the past year understood exactly why. I thanked the regulars who had kept their reservations during the uncertainty and the journalists who had covered the story honestly and the chefs around the city who had said nothing publicly but had said the right things privately when it mattered. Then I said one more thing before leaving the stage. I said that the award meant something specific to me that it might not mean to everyone in the room, not because of what had happened over the past year, but because of what had been true before any of it started. Ember Salt had been built on the belief that honest food made with real intention finds its audience eventually, and that the finding takes exactly as long as it takes and cannot be rushed or shortcut or taken from someone and given to someone else without the audience eventually noticing the difference. I said I was grateful to be standing in a room full of people who had noticed. The applause that followed was longer than I expected. I walked back to my table and sat down, and Daniel put a glass of wine in front of me and said nothing, which was exactly right. The rest of the evening moved around us warmly and without incident. Driving home along the Charleston waterfront afterward, the award sitting on the passenger seat, I thought about the Tuesday evening 8 months earlier when I had sat at my bar watching The Larder House accept this same recognition for food I had spent years developing. I remembered the specific quality of that silence, the dining room empty around me, the television light, the feeling of understanding something too late. That evening had started everything that followed. Every decision I had made since then had come from the clarity that moment had forced on me, and every one of those decisions had led here. I had not gotten here by being louder than Connor or angrier than Dean or more ruthless than either of them. I had gotten here by staying in my kitchen, protecting what I had built, and trusting that the record I had kept honestly over years would eventually speak more clearly than anything anyone else could say about it. That was the only strategy one had ever had. It had been enough. The waterfront lights reflected off the water as I drove, and the city was quiet in the way it gets quiet late on a Saturday when the restaurants have closed and the streets belong to the people walking home. I reached my apartment, carried the award inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and looked at it for a long moment before going to bed. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant prep work starting at 9 and a full dinner service by 6. There was a new dish I had been developing for the winter menu that wasn't quite right yet and needed another few tests before I was ready to put it in front of anyone. I was looking forward to figuring it out.